I always considered myself as kind of caretaker guardian of my dad's business because he wasn't in a position to do so anymore. One of the things that killed our team was the overspending. We were spending, as I mentioned, $120 million a year. The top teams are spending north of $400 million a year. And as a team like Williams, we just could not compete in that space. The money flooding into Formula One now is insane. It's really courtesy of Drive to Survive. I think it was season 4 during that second year of COVID when everyone was at home. That was the time when the interest in it exploded. Very unfortunately, we missed out on that by a year.
When you say you missed out by a year, do you mean with the sale of Williams?
Yes. So we had to sell in 2020. We just ran out of money. We'd have just made it through that 2020. We would, as a family, still be racing. I'm absolutely convinced by that.
Claire, thank you so much for joining us today. We've been so looking forward to having you, so thank you.
Thank you for having me. I'm really excited to be here.
There's only one place we can start, and it is the questions around the family business, the building of a Formula One team. It would be amazing to get a bit of the context and how you even go about setting up an organisation like an F1 team.
Firstly, I should probably say I didn't set up an F1 team, and any F1 fan listening now will know that my dad, Frank Williams, started Williams back in 1969. But that came off the back of my dad actually originally being a racing driver. Turns out he wasn't a very good one, apparently. As far as I'm aware, I wasn't on this planet at that time. But he fell in love with cars from a really young age. My dad was sent to a boarding school at about the age of 5 to kind of deepest, darkest Scotland. He came from a single parent family, and his mum believed education was the way out of, the poverty that he grew up in. And so she supported his education at this great school in Scotland, but it wasn't a very, according to my dad, nice school. And because of my grandmother's job, my dad was always left at school in holidays and weekends. But there was this one father who used to come to collect his son. He was a used car salesman. So every time he'd collect his kid, he would turn up in a nice old Jag or a nice old this or that. And my dad fell in love with cars from those moments. And this very nice father used to actually take my dad on a little spin around the block before then he would take his own son home. And that's where my dad's love affair with cars came from. I think it was an escape from this horrible reality that he was in. So from a young age, he started hitchhiking around England because he couldn't afford train fare. He couldn't afford bus fares. He used to hitchhike because he wanted to go and see other cars, and he realised he could go and do that on a racetrack. Hitchhiked to the circuits, would sleep rough overnight because he couldn't afford the admission fees. So he would sleep rough. He would climb under catch fencing 2-3 in the morning to go and watch, these cars that he adored. And when he was old enough and managed to scrabble a bit of money together, I think his mum lent him some money to get a racing car of his own. He started racing, and that's when it became quickly apparent that he couldn't. He wasn't a brilliant racing driver. Apparently, he was super fast, but never remembered where the brake pedal was. So just always ended up in a gravel trap. So sorry, long story short, but my dad started as a racing driver, realised he wasn't any good, so decided he would start his hand as a constructor.
What was the point of entry like back then for the sport? Because now you couldn't just go and start a team. Obviously, the process of getting involved is really complex. How was that different when he set up the team?
It was obviously a whole lot easier, but for my dad, his point of entry was, I think it was fairly simple back then, and I don't know what the process, the actual operational process was, what forms he needed to fill in or whatever, but he managed to get a spot on the grid. But I think he only had one car in the early days, and that was a car that he kind of begged, borrowed and stealed a chassis from, somewhere, and then he would trade, like some, used car salesman would, he would trade parts around Europe. He lived in a camper van that he would drive around Europe trading car parts in and stuff like that, just to cobble together the money in order to go racing to the few races that he could afford over the course of a season. And the detail of the first decade, I suppose, of my dad's life in Formula One are a bit of a blur to me. My older brother is so much better at the encyclopedic knowledge of our family history in Formula One. But for Dad, he was really hand and mouth in that first decade. Building that team together was incredibly tough because he had no money with which to do it. So, there are all the folklore now that has become, Dad's tales of woe in the early days of trying to get this team together. You only needed about 20 odd people to go racing back in those days in the 1970s, but he never had any money to pay them. So he was always, doing ridiculous things like handing over a watch to an employee for, that person's paycheck if he had a watch. Or, he would, one day there was a story where he bet I think he was sofa surfing with some mates of his because he didn't have anywhere to live. And, he needed money to go and pay his staff salaries. So he bet his flatmates that he wouldn't run to the bottom of the garden where a train line ran when the next train come out butt naked. And all his mates went, yeah, of course you're not going to do that, Frank. And we'll bet you a £5 that you don't. And so sure enough, Dad strips off, runs down to the train line, stands there when the 9:15 from Paddington's coming down and is filled with hundreds of commuters and starts, nakedly flashing all the poor commuters out of London. But he earned the money to pay for his team. So it is not my dad's, I suppose, embryonic stage is in Formula One, and building Williams were just really unusual. The bailiffs were at the door. He was operating out of phone boxes down the end of the road. But it was the grit and determination that my dad had that, saw him through to those latter years in the 1970s when he really was able to build more of a team as some sponsorship dollars came in. He attracted, Patrick Head and some other brilliant engineers into Williams. And then he was able to really build it from there.
Was that the first time sponsorship dollars and really outside investment came in then, almost 10 years after he started that team?
I think one of his first sponsorships came in the early 1970s from, a Dutch beer brand. But they were really few and far between. The first real sponsorship dollars I think my dad got that was really significant were from Saudi Airlines. And that was, through my dad finding out, I think he'd gone to Saudi. He'd heard that Saudi Airlines might be willing to do something because one of the sons of is it an emir in Saudi? I'm sorry. Was obsessed with cars and obsessed with motorsport. And so my dad just thought to himself, right, that's the guy I'm going to go and target. And, obviously all the money in the country for all those businesses like the airlines all came from, the kingdom, from that pot. And so my dad, I think, went over and decamped to Saudi for months, 1 year, to go and try and get some sponsorship money. Never materialised, but one day happened to find out that this prince was staying at I think it was the Grosvenor in London, decided to get a chassis painted in Saudi airline colours, green and white, and he went and plonked it, literally had a low loader turn up outside this hotel. One random day this guy was staying there and deposited the car in the front of the doors. And I think all the concierge, the bell guys saying, what the hell are you doing? And my dad kind of made it all right, as my dad was very charming and always did. And he waited for hours and hours for this guy to come out. And eventually he did. And he said, Prince, I think he was Prince Faisal, I am Williams and this is the car and these are your colours. Please sponsor my racing team. And the rest is history. And he did. And that was the first major sponsorship Williams had.
It's amazing for me because my job is a venture capitalist by day, and it's to invest in unbelievable generational defining founders, which is pretty much exactly like the sound of your father in this unwavering persistence and hustle.
He never gave up, and that was just an extraordinary sense or tale of resilience, I suppose, because he also got an enormous amount of grief. He was called, if I can say it, Wanker Williams by everybody in the paddock, because, they would give him the mop and bucket and he would be told to go and clean the bogs in the paddock. That was, how he was considered. He was the absolute loser of Formula One at the time.
But he was absolutely uncompromising, wasn't he, in his work ethic to this? Nothing came ahead of it, including
nothing ever came
family,
ahead of it.
sort of home.
Yeah.
Did that hurt? Because I saw Charlie's amazing with research, but I'm addicted to motor racing. It's what matters most. I mean, I have a family which I love very much, but they tend to take second place to the business. Was that hard?
No, it wasn't. And you look surprised. I adored my dad, and my dad could do no wrong in my eyes. And I think when you're young, there's no kind of sense of time really in relative terms like we have when we're older. And so when you're young and your dad's out and, he's not around a whole lot, you don't think about it. You're young, the world revolves around you. Your dad might come in every so often. And when my dad came in, it was heaven. And I spent so much time with him. But when he was out, he was out because that's what he did. So so it never bothered me that even when I did get older and he did say stuff like that, and the language actually that he used, and I do have a family, it's kind of, but it's second, it tells everything about him. He was never apologetic about that. Formula One was his absolute be all and end all. And I admired that about Dad. But I think sometimes Dad said that, but actually, if you knew my dad behind the scenes, he adored his family. I know what our relationship was like. And I know how much he adored my mother. And, if it wasn't for my mum, Williams probably wouldn't ever have made it, because it was her money that actually bankrolled so much of it in the 1970s. And, when she died, she left an enormous hole in his life because she was there, propping up everything in the background, raising us children. She was the one that got him through his accident. Williams probably wouldn't have made it. And my dad definitely would have probably died after his car accident if it weren't for my mum. So as much as my dad came out with these, Formula One is everything, his family meant everything as well. And I think, anybody that has been successful in business has to have that myopic kind of focus, don't they? You have to remain, you'll get this, you have to remain unblinkered in the focus that when you want to achieve, when you've got a dream like my dad had. Outside influences can be detrimental to when you need to grow a business, when you want to be really successful. Some people can manage both and do it very successfully. But, for my dad, certainly in that early era, he really needed to have that pure focus on Formula One, and he retained that throughout. And that is one of the reasons why he was so successful, why he didn't come home in the evening and watch TV. He came home and he continued working when he came home. Sometimes he would stay in the office till God knows what time. And that's why, people like him are successful as they are, because it's 100% focus.
So I kind of want to dive into then that specific role, because this is something that I think we've now got so much more exposure to the inner workings of Formula One for, Drive to Survive and stuff that we'll talk about later, but the mediafication of the sport as well, bringing personalities, characters. There's a lot more interest around the people behind the scenes and how they run the teams. What is the job of the team principal, the individual that is running the organisation, like your father was when he was at Williams?
It's probably a good job that my dad wasn't running Williams when Netflix and Drive to Survive came along, because he would have had no interest whatsoever. It's funny, it's really changed the sport, this, what I call them, the kind of second and now almost third generation of team principals. When my dad was running Williams and his peers were the likes of Ron Dennis at McLaren, Luca Di Montezemolo at Ferrari, all these guys, they were running their teams. And mostly they were their teams, they owned them. They were owner-founders for decades and decades. And then suddenly in the kind of 2010s and on, we had a whole raft of changes when it came to who was running the teams. It was a whole new generation of team principals, the likes of Christian Horner, Toto Wolff, that all, I think, are so different in the way they run the teams because of the environment has changed so much, in that people, the fan is consuming sport in a different way. And so we are having to embrace the likes of Drive to Survive and a greater level of scrutiny and interest in the inner workings of Formula One teams and other sports teams as a whole. We want to know what's under the bonnet, don't we, these days? It's not good enough for the fan to see, what is on the screen on a Sunday afternoon. They want to know how those two race cars get there on a Sunday afternoon. Whereas the previous generation, I think, were much more focused on, the business and not saying, sorry, that sounds like I'm saying that this generation aren't, but they had no interest in mediafication of the sport. It just wasn't on the radar. But I suppose it wasn't for so many other sports, so many other industries.
The world has just changed. Do you not think this generation is interested in mediafication because of the business, because of the desire for global audiences, better rights deals, and actually it's a means to get the better business? Exactly.
And I think that's exactly what has changed from a marketing and comms perspective in sport these days, and how, those teams working in those areas are looking at what they're doing and what they're having to do in order to drive the fan and the fan engagement. Because if they don't have the fan engagement, they don't bring in the sponsors. And if you don't bring in the sponsors, then you don't have the budget to go racing. And it was certainly something that we put at Williams a huge focus on when things weren't going so well, just organically from a sponsored, attraction perspective. in the days of my dad running the commercial function, running the business in the 90s and the 2000s, sponsors were knocking on the door. You didn't really have to go out and try and find your sponsors, so to speak. They were coming to you and offering you $40 million to sponsor your race team, and you were turning them down. I found a letter once from my dad to one of the world's biggest tech companies, turning a $40 million offer down for a title sponsor back in the 2000s because he had one for 50. I could only have dreamt of those kinds of numbers when I was running the team. And that's why we all had to adapt and do things really differently. And doing things really differently meant opening the doors and welcoming the fan, because the fan is what our partners wanted. They wanted that information, that data that we all know now is so important for sponsors and for businesses.
Do you have the bandwidth as a principal to work both driver's side in the garage, on the car, and run the business? How does that delegation work within the team and the responsibilities you take on?
So I was across everything within Williams. So my day was like one day to the next was completely different, and 1 hour to the next was, so I would have a schedule, for example, for the day, and from 9 till 10 I would be with my aero team talking about the Y250 vortex on the front wing, for example, and why, we weren't able to control it in the way that we needed to. And the next minute I would be sat with the marketing department talking to them about Unilever and, the guests that they were bringing to the next weekend, or the next race weekend. And then the next minute I would be with the motorhomers talking about, what sea freight that they were going to be packing to whatever race, and were we on time, and, could we make it cheaper to do that? And so from my perspective as a team principal, I had to be able to be across all areas of the organisation. It was a non-negotiable. If you're going to run your team successfully, you've got to be across every single element. And so you've got to make the time. You've got to have the bandwidth to be able to do that. But certainly from my perspective, what I was also very particular about was making sure I had really great people around me. I could never have run that team. We were 1,000 people by myself. It would have been absolutely impossible. So I had a brilliant CEO, I had a brilliant CFO, I had a brilliant senior management team that I trusted wholeheartedly to do, so much of the work while I was just, kind of parachuting in at the top level.
What was the revenues of 1,000 people?
So I say 1,000 people loosely, I suppose. We had the F1 team, but we also had within our Williams group an advanced engineering business. So the divide was about 650, 700 on F1, and the balance working in our advanced engineering business as well.
Got you. And so when you break down the P&L, I'm sorry for naive questions, when you break down, what are the inflows? It's like the sponsors?
Two. So the main sources of revenue for us were sponsorship and prize fund money. And as Williams was one, while I was running it, we were pretty much the last remaining what we called independent teams, which basically meant that we did not have I suppose if I can call them a sugar daddy, that we would go to when things were tough to write blank checks for us to plug the gaps on the budget to go racing. So we relied solely on sponsorship and prize fund money as our revenue sources. And we had a budget of about 120 million sterling a year. So the majority of the time we were looking for about 60, 70 million in sponsorship to go racing, and the rest came from prize fund. But the problem with Formula One that I had during my time, and what made life so difficult, was the way the revenues in Formula One are distributed. And most of this is incredibly confidential, and I can't reveal all, but there are what we call columns of money and prize and distribution, and one of which relates to where you finish in the Constructors' Championship, as how much you get, the bulk of that fund, how that comes to you. So you finish P1 in the championship, you're getting, an incredible amount of money from the commercial rights holder from Formula One for finishing first. But it ratchets down. You finish last and you are getting, nothing, hardly anything. So you can imagine an independent team. When I was running the team, I took the team to 2 third place, 2 fifths. We were getting tens and tens of millions in prize fund money to bankroll us for the next year. When our performance started slipping and we fell right to the floor and we hit P10, our prize fund pot halved. And that was tune of about 30 million. And when you're, that's a quarter of your overall budget from one year to the next dissipates and is gone, that's a massive problem to have.
Where's that felt most? If you don't have that money, what's being sacrificed in the team? What isn't performing as well?
Everything. When you sacrifice that amount of money, it's so difficult. And that's one of the reasons why we had so much trouble. You sink so fast. It is just a spiral of terrifying decline. It's like going on one of those rides at Alton Towers where you get, slowly taken to the top, but then suddenly you are just plonked right on the floor. And to get back up is just so difficult.
It's worth just kind of going back and contextualizing your position within the team. I don't know how you best want to describe it because, what were the roles that you had?
It's quite tricky because my formal title was Deputy Team Principal. So when I originally took over the running of the business in 2013, that happened then that year. The year prior, I'd been put on the board as a family representative in the role of kind of Director of Marketing and Communications because I had been in that role for a couple of years, responsible for bringing the budget and all the marketing brand elements of the team. And prior to that, I'd worked in the communications office. When I stepped into that role, my dad was still on the board and he was still vaguely operating, running the business day to day. But my dad had, as much as he was a quadriplegic, he was getting older, and there are issues that come with individuals that are getting older that I wouldn't want to go into necessarily. But my role was absolutely that of team principal, but I just never took over that title in deference to my dad. So it was my dad's team. It was always, Williams was always Frank Williams's team. He was always team principal, and he was incredibly proud and protective of that TP title, and he never wanted to relinquish it. And I knew that, and I never wanted to force the issue. I never wanted to force him to hand it over just because he wasn't running the business day to day. It didn't feel right. So I always was happy to operate as deputy, even though I was operating as TP and everyone just called me de facto team principal.
Was that quite difficult then? Because did you feel more steward of institution rather than capable innovator, and knowing that you're going to wear the responsibility of the performance of the team, yet your actual opportunity to influence decision making may not be as many would expect? How did you handle that relationship?
In my head, or kind of as a position, I always felt or considered myself as kind of caretaker guardian of my dad's business because he wasn't in a position to do so anymore. But on practical terms, that equally means that I had to operate and function as the leader of this business and do everything that entails. That was like a non-negotiable. I was running it each and every day. In the early days, I think a lot of other people took a long time to get their heads around that. They took a long time to understand that, and whether that be in my team or within the Formula One paddock and operating environment, they took a long time to realise that Frank was not running the team anymore. And that probably wasn't a surprise. My dad had been running Williams for 4 decades. It's a long time. People, when they thought of Williams, it was Frank. You go to Frank. That's who you talk to. And he was no longer able to do that. And then his daughter was there. And I think that, just the fact that I was a woman, and I was a very young woman at the time. I was 36 when I took over the team, and I was Frank's daughter. People were a bit like, well, why is she running it? What's she got? Why they should have brought some, bigwig CEO in from the city or something to run this team. I think a lot of people took some time to get their head around it, and that hampered me a little bit because when people don't buy into you as the leader, they don't respect you and they don't do what you're asking for, whether that be internally or externally. So I had those challenges, but I think probably after 2 or 3 years, people obviously clearly came to understand that I was running the business and I was operating as team principal and that I needed to be able to do that.
Can I ask, going back to the P&L, do we see that evolve over time? We mentioned the prize money and we mentioned sponsorships. I don't understand. Why is there no ticketing and hospitality? Why is there no global merchandising?
So it all goes in. So everything that the commercial rights holder, so Formula One, the Formula One group, does, from hospitality, ticket sales, merchandise, that all goes into that prize fund pot, including all the money that they make from their contracts with the TV broadcasters, as well as the deals that they do with the likes of Drive to Survive. All of that, all of the sponsorships, so that you see like Saudi Aramco now on the racetracks, all of that all goes into that prize fund pot. And that pot, a proportion of it, is divided up to the teams as their prize fund money.
What was the biggest sponsor that you had?
When I took over the team, we did a huge amount of transformation work in order to try and improve our performance. And because I inherited the team when we'd finished 9th, 8th and 9th in the championship the previous few years. And after doing a lot of work, we changed our driver lineup, we changed our engine partnership, and we did a huge restructure in our technical department. But we also brought in Martini as a title sponsor. And we hadn't really had I suppose, in inverted commas, proper title sponsor for a while. And Martini, for us, we actually managed to steal them off Ferrari. Ferrari were just like seconds away from signing them, and we managed to bag them, which Ferrari were livid about, which was wonderful for me. And they were brilliant because they'd been in motorsport previously, so they had a heritage, and they wanted to kind of rebrand. And for me taking over the team, I was all kind of in the mindset of trying to create this team in my own image. And so to have a brand like Martini, which was kind of looking to the future, it was really fun. They wanted to bring media influencers into races. You know, David Gandy was their ambassador, all this kind of stuff. And they wanted to completely rebrand the car and have the Martini stripes. And if anyone remembers the Williamses from 2014, 15, I mean, it was just that wonderful Martini livery. That for me was one of the best partnerships that we did because it really elevated us. It kind of showed the world that this was a whole new generation of Williams. But then the Unilever partnership that we had was a huge partnership for us that came in. We bought that in 2015 and they stayed for 5 years.
Can I ask, is that like just brand marketing for them where it's like, hey, we're going to be on cars in front of millions of people? Or do they go, we want data, we want attribution, we want really, really transparent reporting? How does that work?
So one of the things that I changed when I took over the team and the commercial side of it was, and I say I did it wasn't like I was a huge innovator in this space, but you know, sport sponsorship back then was all about sticking your sticker on the race car or wherever you were sticking it, you know, and that was it. And then you might take some people to the races with you, do some hospitality. And because being independent, we really needed to think out the box because the sponsorship dollars just weren't floating around Formula One as much as they used to be. It was really hard. Yeah. And so we were like, right, what are our other assets that we can bring to the party here to try and attract sponsorship? So it's not just about sticking a sticker on a race car. That's the final piece. What else do we do? What else can we sell? And fortunately for us, you know, Williams, being with the legacy that it had, was such a wonderful destination, I think, for partners. They understood the values that we had as an organisation and they appreciated them and wanted to work and be partnered with a business like ours that had the values that we did of family and teamwork and honesty and integrity. They knew where those dollars were going to end up when they put them into our team, and that was on performance in our race car. They weren't going to go and fund, you know, some CEO's private jet or, you know, yacht or anything like that. It was purely about our racing team. But equally, we tried to look at, okay, so you've got this business. What can your skill set bring to ours? And how can we benefit each other's businesses in that way? So you're putting a load of money into ours, but can we drive any revenue or gains to your business through the skills that we have? So, for example, the Unilever partnership that I just mentioned, and earlier I mentioned the fact that we had an advanced engineering business. That engineering business, hopefully to try and cut a long story short here, in a nutshell, took the technologies that we developed in Formula One and commercialised them. So around things like battery technology, lightweighting of materials, how to build efficiency into teams, all this kind of stuff. Unilever, one of the reasons they sponsored with us was not because they wanted to put their deodorant brand on the side of our car. It was because they wanted to understand and to capitalise on the intelligence, I suppose, that we had built over 40 years of racing in a high-pressured, fast-paced environment. And through this advanced engineering business, we were able to deliver a lot of skills and solutions to some of the issues that they had around efficiencies within their organisation.
How do you even begin to put numbers on that when the value extends so far across the company?
We had numbers from Unilever. So, for example, we had some very clever people working on regeneration of energies. And in Unilever, They have these huge, great cooling towers around the world that make their washing powders, and they spend an awful lot of money on the driving efficiencies and trying to make them more efficient. Because you can imagine huge, open, exposed outlets for these are losing huge amounts of energy. We were able to provide a solution where they could recapture the majority of that previously lost energy and reuse it. So the tens of millions of dollars that we were saving Unilever in costs around their washing powder plants more than paid for their sponsorship that they put into the race team, probably by, 5-10-fold.
And then you have the brand exposure, which they're getting them for free as an ancillary on top of that.
Yeah, exactly. And that wasn't, we did many programs with Unilever. And so that was where we really tried to make the difference. And it really worked well for us when we were talking to tech companies. When I inherited Williams, we did a deep dive into our IT infrastructure to see where it was and what we needed to do to improve things. So I brought a new IT director and gave him 3 months to do a full inventory. And he came to me with like white ashen face one day after this 3-month period. And I said, geez, Graham, what's happened? What have you found? He said, we're a decade out of date here. It is going to cost 10 million to bring us back. We didn't have 10 million to spend on IT back then. So what we did through partnerships was bring in sponsors that had the skill set and the assets, they had the people that could actually bring our IT infrastructure up to meet current standards of Formula One. And we didn't really have to pay a penny for that. They bought all of that to us.
Can I ask, in terms of like IT spending, in terms of engineering spending, we covered the what comes into the machine money-wise. In terms of what goes out on the other end, what are the core expenditures for an F1 team? And how does that break down?
People, travel, and
people is like
car.
70%?
People is the majority. My God, percentages. It's been 5 years since I looked at our balance sheets.
Just broad strokes, kind of like 30, 50, 70?
Yeah, people is probably more like 30, 40%.
Okay.
And then travel is huge. So if you think about it, you're flying, goodness knows how many people around the world, weekend in, weekend out, and then all the extra travel on testing and commercial marketing people as well. Outside of that, that's probably another 30% too. And then you've got the rest is going on developing and building the race car. And at Williams, we were very proud of the fact that we designed and manufactured the whole of our race car in-house. So many teams outsourced quite a lot of components. The only thing that we obviously outsourced were our engine and tyres. And so a huge amount of our money obviously was spent on the design and manufacture. So we had to manufacture every single part of our race car, tens of thousands of parts within our HQ.
Of the people side, how much of that is driver?
How much do you spend on your drivers?
Yeah.
Well, it depends what team you are. How much has Lewis just signed for at Ferrari?
40.
Yeah, it's all relative. In my earlier time, I had budget to pay drivers. I had Felipe, Massa and Valtteri, and the expectation was you would pay them. In my latter time, we weren't really paying our drivers, and that doesn't feel good. You can pay them small amounts because that's the right thing to do to give them some money, but it was really difficult. And quite a few teams up and down the grid weren't paying their drivers a huge amount in that kind of 17, 18, 19 period of Formula One, which the money was not, Formula One, very different operating environment than what you see today.
When you say not paying them, is that like they're on like $1 million a year, not 10 million a year?
No, I mean less than $1 million, like way less, like 150K. Wow. And that was cobbled together because one of the assets as well that you have to sell in Formula One when things aren't going so well is a race seat. And unfortunately, that's what I ended up having to do. I had to sell race seats. So as much as those seats...
What do you mean selling race seats?
Bring in a pay driver. So a driver that had a sponsor that had, 10 million to put that driver into your car.
Is that common?
It was common in my time because it was one of what sponsors just weren't there. You couldn't get sponsors. We were fighting over title sponsorships between us teams, even the bigger teams, and selling our souls for like $7 or $8 million.
Sponsors backing the individual drivers.
Yeah.
And therefore, are they doing that because it's better value? They then know if they get an access to the team. Does that convert to the team as well?
It's normally because that driver has come up through the junior championships with that sponsor, or they have found them and they come along and go, I've got a sponsor, I want a race seat. And then you go, well, how much is it? And they'll go 10, 15 million. And when you're, Williams back in 2017, 2018, you cannot afford to turn that money down because no one else is offering you that money.
So correct me if I'm wrong in this statement. Then we have the salary caps in, or should we say the spending caps in that have been introduced. That's really exclusively for the car and the mechanics and the actual functioning, not for driver salaries, etc. So while it may balance the production side and the car development, teams are still obviously able to spend huge amounts of money on the people driving the cars.
Yes, and they're 2 or 3 top employees. So when we were
Very
putting
topical.
these, so when so I was a big.
I heard about this one.
When I was a big part of negotiating those the new financial regulations, and it was one of the things I was probably most proud when I left of having been a part of accomplishing and putting this cost cap into Formula One, because it was one of the things that killed our team was the I call it that overspending. Our team, independent team, we were spending, as I mentioned, 120 million a year going racing, and for me that was a appropriate, if I can call it that, amount of money to go Formula One racing. More than that, I mean, it's just like we're into crazy territory in my opinion. But bigger teams were spending way more money than us a year. I mean, the top teams are spending north of $300-400 million a year, and you can't, as a team like Williams, we just could not compete in that space, and so hence falling down the championship order, losing your prize fund money, and then it all just spirals well out of control. So the opportunity came up that when Liberty first bought Formula One to talk about a cost cap, and so we were absolute key proponents of that cost cap and trying to get that through. It took 3 years to negotiate, and the driver salaries, though, were something that a lot of the TPs negotiated to be excluded from the pot.
And they wanted them excluded because it meant that they had so much more freedom to...
Yes, and there's also the argument that you can't dictate how much you pay somebody. I think it's a European law or something, isn't it?
Yeah, but salary caps are quite a popular conversation in other sports, particularly in football, where you just get these crazy numbers thrown out now, and people looking at ways to control it because the losses in the companies, so much of it is down to wages. I guess slightly different when it's in Formula One because it is a singular driver, but they can still get a huge amount. But I was going to say, it's a bit like turkeys voting for Christmas. If you're going into that conversation and you're trying to get Red Bull, Mercedes to agree to this cap, when for you it makes obviously complete sense to level that playing field. That was probably the piece of information they had to have separate to allow them to keep what they would view as their kind of dominance.
And there are quite a few exclusions to that cost cap. It was things like capex. So certain teams that perhaps hadn't been able to spend. I think capex was put in. There was a ceiling on capex, and certain teams hadn't been able to reach that ceiling. So, you were able to look back at your numbers over the previous 3 years, and whatever the delta had been between the new ceiling level and what you had spent, you could then spend in your first year, and it wouldn't be a drama. So quite weird, and
I'm not being rude. If you're not including the driver's salary, and the driver's the one driving the car. Spending caps, it's like spending caps on teams but not including it on players.
Maybe you could spend a huge amount on the development and engineering.
I get that,
cars,
but
right?
still it is like one of the core components.
But it actually, you say it, but it never bothered me. And if, you would have thought, being in my position at that time, a team, running a team that was struggling incredibly or was in real trouble, that if it just didn't bother me, and if it was going to, it would have done, because your expenditure, what was the cap, 160 that we put in for the first year, that felt it was bringing the operational spending down for the bigger teams. They were currently spending 300 million. They had to shave 140 million of costs of expenditure out of their business within a very short period of time. So actually they had a much harder run of things, if you think about it. When you're operating at that level, how you shave out that kind of expenditure within a short period of time to get down to the new cost cap, incredibly difficult. As much as it leveled the playing field, they had a really difficult time. But the driver's fee, it's almost irrelevant, really.
Does the way that the distributions are structured not really make all of this kind of null and void in some respects, in the way that if one team at the top is getting a huge proportion of the gains and the other is getting a tiny amount?
Those were adjusted too. So we managed to level up the prize fund pot to a degree as well. And equally, there are some other payments there that I can't talk about that were renegotiated.
Does that then not massively denigrate the value of these teams in enterprise markets for buyers? If we've got this equalization and spending caps, like, is it an asset class that's good to invest in?
No, I actually think it's an absolute benefit. And that was one of the reasons it was done, in order to make Formula One a more favourable destination for investors. Because, who really wants to come in, or who can come in and buy a team and look at having to spend $300 or $400 million a year to be successful? Nobody. Certainly not back then. Maybe, in American NFL and all that kind of stuff, those numbers are washing around, and in British football, in English football, whatever, or not just English football, everywhere. That wasn't the case at the time in Formula One. So what you were doing was just creating this two-tiered championship of the haves and the have-nots. And that is not, an area I don't think that attracts, or a situation that attracts investment. We needed a much more level playing field, and teams were only allowed to spend, this amount of money, so that, potential investors were looking at it going, okay, well, that is reasonable. At the time, how many major manufacturers were in Formula One? A handful. Now, the likes of Audi are coming in because they know they're not going to have to spend 300 million of their marketing budget to go Formula One racing to be successful. They only need to spend, 140 now. The cost cap is at, I think. So that makes it much more plausible for those guys to go and talk to the boards of their organisations and say, we should do Formula One now because it's sensible. When I would be talking about, Formula One and it being a great place to invest and all the rest of it, someone said that it was a friend of my husband's actually, and he'd been asked to invest or buy a Formula One team, and he said, I'm not an idiot, I'm in business to make money, and the surefire, quickest way of losing money is to own a Formula One team. I mean, it's true. When I'm asked about running Williams and how, I met the challenges and all the rest of it, and the strangest thing about Formula One, and certainly during my time, is that you aren't in the business to make money. I was not there at the end of the year asking my CFO what our bottom line looked like from a, profit perspective. I wasn't sitting there going, brilliant, we've made 25 million this year. It was like, we're on zero. That's wonderful, because that means that, we've spent what we had, and that's what you're looking to do.
What was the best year? What was the worst year?
Oh, gosh. Best and worst. I think probably the earlier years, certainly 2014 and probably the best, because we finished third in the constructors. So we had a lot of prize fund money. We were doing pretty well from a sponsorship perspective. And Formula One was a lot cheaper. We were running, we were being very successful with 120 million. And then suddenly this huge expenditure happened at the top end of the grid. The technical regulations went crazy. And so the years from 17 onwards were the hardest years financially for us.
Can you pinpoint that, something that created the drop from the third to fifth and then to those struggles? Was there something that happened specifically in the team, or was it broader in the...
No, I was the leader of that team, and the buck will always stop with me. And there were absolutely decisions that we made, that I made, that, there was probably one or two in particular that didn't go our way. They should have done, and they didn't. And all I can ever say to that, and I can never talk in detail about it, but all I would ever say is that I only ever made the decisions that I made with my heart in the right place and believing that they were the right decisions at the time based on all the information that I had. And invariably at the time those decisions were being made, everyone was going, great decisions, that's brilliant. And then for whatever reason, they just didn't pan out. And that's just life, unfortunately. And that's what happened. But equally, Formula One as a sport, as I've just talked about, was becoming, the operating environment of the sport was becoming incredibly difficult with the level of expenditure and the complexity of the regulations.
Do you think that Formula One is a better investable asset class today, given Drive to Survive, given the mediafication? Everything about sport is about expanding the time people engage. Pre-drinks, the dinner before, the post-drinks, it's about the whole experience. Yeah. Is it a better asset class to own now? And can you make money owning teams?
Yes. And that is the great thing about this cost cap, because you can absolutely make money, because you can only spend, the $140 million. And the money flooding into Formula One now, because all your mates are going with all this money, is insane. And, very unfortunately, we missed out on that by a year. a team that had been in the sport for 50 years.
I think you've got a new breed of sponsors as well.
You have a new breed of sponsors, you've got the interest, and it's really courtesy of Drive to Survive. What that programme has done for Formula One is extraordinary. So yeah, it's absolutely.
When you say you missed out by a year, do you mean with the sale of Williams?
Yes. So we had to sell in 2020. And I think, Drive to Survive was already filming Formula One at the time. I think we were 2 seasons in and they were going into our third. And I think it was season 4 that, I think during that second year of COVID, when everyone was at home, going, what am I going to watch? That was the time when, Formula One, just the interest in it exploded, courtesy of Drive to Survive. So if we'd have just made it through that 2020, we would, as a family, still be racing. I'm absolutely convinced by that.
Are you sad about that? I mean, it's incredibly grueling on your life. The sleepless nights, the unbelievable workload and stress and pressure. I mean, don't get me wrong, it's such a part of your life. But actually, is it like I'm pleased that we exited when we did?
There is not one day when I ever have the emotion that I'm pleased that we sold Williams. No, never. I never ever think that. I will probably live with, everyone will probably go, oh, she's so dramatic and whatever, but I will live with the heartbreak of losing it every single day, because it wasn't a decision that we made as a family to sell because we'd had enough of Formula One, or, we wanted to cash out. No, we all wanted, to stay in it. It was our life forever. That was the plan. I wanted to run the team for, my son or my nephews.
How did the decision come then? They approach you and say, hey, we want to buy Williams.
No, we just ran out of money, not to put too fine a point on it. So at the tail end of 2019, for the 29 season, we had a title sponsor. And then going into the latter part of 19, talking about, the payments for 2020, which were contracted, never materialised. And, when you lose a title sponsor when they're not paying, and it's there now. I mean, we took them to court and we won. They owe us 30 odd million quid, which is half of the money they actually owed us. And they've had the court judgment to say that.
Have they paid yet?
No. So they obviously didn't pay. And that obviously left a huge hole in our budget going into 2020. But we were very fortunate in that we had somebody that came along and plugged that gap for us. So we were able to start the season. Unfortunately, when we started the season and we arrived in Melbourne, COVID hit. And we all went home again. We didn't go racing, and we didn't go racing to July that year. And when you don't go racing, you don't get money. And so that was the final nail in our coffin. So it was a thing, it's completely out of our hands. Unfortunately, events transpired.
So I'm sure people will think you cashed out, so to speak, as you.
Not as much as we would have done if we would have stayed in after.
I was going to say, literally it is, isn't it?
I wasn't bringing that up. I wasn't getting that.
For 40 years of racing, it doesn't feel like.
Do you sell a team for much money?
Based on what the teams are worth now, no. But that's by the by. It's more money than most people have in a lifetime. And, I don't care about that. What I care about is we were very fortunate, Paul, was that we found people that wanted to buy Williams that were the kind of people we wanted to sell it to.
Who did you want to sell it to?
Good people. People that, I'm sorry, I'll get upset now, but people that would look after the team, look after its legacy, and look after the people that we loved and that were our family. And we were very lucky because that wasn't, 2020 was a horrible time for everybody. People were not buying businesses, and they certainly weren't buying flailing Formula One teams. And we were very fortunate that these people came along and they did exactly that. And so that was the greatest outcome that we could have had.
Do you retain any ownership now?
No. I'm quite gutted that as part of the deal, I didn't just say, well, we want to retain 5%, but never mind.
But they wanted the name. They wanted the brand value of Williams.
They did, yeah. And that's why Williams is still racing in Formula One today.
We did touch on it earlier, but I think it is really important to talk about it. And it's what it was like for you as the role of as a woman in Formula One, and being in that male-dominated environment at the top, making the decisions. How did you manage that? How did you handle it?
So when I first started running the team, it never really entered my head that I was, a woman. And there was, in fact, a lady called Monisha Kautenborn at the time who was running Sauber. I think because I had worked at Williams prior to that for 10 odd years, and then I'd grown up in this sport, I was really desensitized to the fact that it was a really male-heavy, male-dominated industry. It didn't enter my head. But when I started to do all my media work, as a TP, you're doing a huge amount of interviews, not just at the race weekend, but in between Grand Prix as well. The first question that I would always be asked by any journalist, male and men and women, was, what's it like being a woman running a Formula One team? And, after like a few of these interviews, it would be like, why? Why are you asking me that? What do you want my answer to be? It felt like such an odd question. And it started really annoying me, actually. And so my answer then would be, well, do you ask Toto what it's like being a man running a Formula One team? You wouldn't ask that. So why are you asking me? And then, there was, I think, certainly I got some, because I was a woman, not just the interviews, but because, I was a female running a team and I was quite a young female doing it. There were a lot of questions about, the sensibility of putting me into that role. But all I felt was, it's just another challenge I've got to face, and just the only way you face challenges is to prove people wrong. And so I just needed to get my head down and put the work in and prove to people that I deserved to be in my role. However, there were certain times during my tenure where I touched, on an example briefly when it came to sponsorship, that there were certain behaviours that didn't sit comfortably with me as a woman. And when I was starting to consider this in light of, a lot of the Me Too movement that was coming out, it was like, well, if I'm experiencing some of these behaviours and disrespect, operating as a team principal, being a woman, and not only that, but the boss's daughter, Frank Williams' daughter, what are my female employees experiencing? Are they experiencing even worse? And so I decided to have conversations with a lot of the women in my business, and some of the experiences that they'd experienced weren't great either. And so kind of as a consequence of that, I decided to make a lot of changes within my organisation as to how women, the environment in which we provided women to operate so that they could thrive. So things like, formerly the maternity leave, as an example, the maternity pay wasn't brilliant for women. So we overhauled that completely and made it a really great policy that we had, just so that, when you're in Formula One and you get pregnant, it's very difficult to go back racing. It's really hard. I had experienced that myself. It was incredibly difficult. So just off the back of that experience, it was like, well, I don't want to lose these great women that have, given 10 years of their life to Williams, but now want to have a baby and so then can't come back and do their job. Let's change things. But equally, we put in a whole respect policy to make sure that women were treated in the same way that men were in the office. So we put in a women's networking group. So I'm kind of, firing around the place here. But there was a lot of stuff that I just wanted to do to make the journey better for the next generation of females coming up, because I'd experienced it, but also it was just the right thing to do.
I always find it really interesting, especially like from my realm investing. There's a lot of guy investors and people say, God, he's a killer. He is so good. He's a killer. And then there's kind of female investors who are just the same and they go, she's aggressive.
She is
aggressive.
Yeah.
And you're like, well, okay.
Have you met him?
Yeah. Do you feel like because you're a woman, you got treated differently in that respect?
I definitely was treated differently, but I was normally treated with a huge amount of respect and actual care. I would be the only woman in the room during the strategy group meetings, and the strategy group was the forum through which Formula One was effectively run. And I had a seat at that table. Only 6 teams and their team principals were at that table with the governing body, the FIA and F1. And in those meetings, we would meet every race, and then outside of race weekends, probably once every 2 months. I would be the only woman in that room out of 30 men, and we'd be in that room for 6 to 8 hours. And that's hard going. And you can imagine there's ego in that room as well.
Has that changed now? I mean,
No,
photo
now...
that's a terrible photo to go on Twitter. Can you imagine that?
Oh, yes.
Well, like 30 men and 1 woman.
Well, I think a photo was posted of them all having dinner together, and it was all men now. Obviously, I'm the last female team principal, but I was always treated with nothing but respect by everybody in that room, and care actually. And I think I always found that actually being a woman, it brought some advantage in that space, because I didn't have the ego. And I, as much as I wasn't part of a lot of the boys' clubs that were going around, I was able to remain relatively apolitical. I didn't have those kinds of relationships. So when it came to what I needed to do, I could do it. I could go and have, conversations, because I just had quite an agnostic relationship with all these people. And I had a good relationship, because that's the way I had kept it, probably because of the male-female thing. It just worked that way for me.
Let's take that same thing onto the grid. Why do we not have any female drivers on the grid?
I think that it's a kind of critical mass reason. So if you think about it, when drivers that you see on the grid today, the male drivers, they have all started their careers at a very young age. So when you guys probably were young and your parents said, what would you like to do at the weekend? I bet occasionally you might say, I'd love to go go-karting. Girls of your generation, my generation, we were not saying to their parents, we want to go go-karting. We wanted to go and play with our Barbie dolls and do all that kind of girly stuff. And so you didn't have girls starting karting. When you don't have girls starting karting at that young age, they don't then create that funnel going up through kind of the pyramid to reach Formula One. You just don't have that critical mass at grassroots level, because it wasn't something that was encouraged or even thought about, that girls really go off and do at a young age, go-karting. And that's why there is so much work now, because if we are going to see a female line up on a Sunday afternoon, which, by the way, Formula One is the very few sports that, in inverted commas again, allows women to compete against men. If we're going to see that, then we've got to have all the initiatives in place that is actually going out there and encouraging girls at a young age to start go-karting. Because if they don't start go-karting young, you aren't going to enter Formula One through a junior championship not having ever been in a go-kart or another car at the age of 14, 15. You're just not going to do it.
You wouldn't put them in the same race, though, would you?
Yes.
But I'm not being rude. It's not a question of physicality.
No, so I mean, it's a question that is asked all the time, and my answer is, why can't women develop themselves so that they are as strong as men? Because physicality is about going to the gym and putting the work in, isn't it?
You say that across any sport, though.
Exactly. Well, you look at female.
But you wouldn't have women playing in men's football.
It's a contact sport.
Yeah.
This, and please correct me if I'm wrong, but just saying, in a car, you have to build your body in a specific way to be able to handle the forces really on you. That's where the physicality comes into it, right?
Exactly.
So a woman would have to do that in exactly the same way. It doesn't make her drive slower. If her body is conditioned to be able to withstand those, maybe think like an astronaut. I don't know, but
Yeah, it's the same. Well, look at female bodybuilders can build their body up to that degree. So why couldn't I build my body up to then be able to withstand the forces of a Formula One car and the pressures that are required to drive that Formula One car?
No, you can, but it's like Serena Williams, who said, famously, that if she was in a male competition, she'd be 250th in the rankings. And so it's like, you can, but you won't be in the race.
But she is directly physically competing. She is hitting a ball across the net to someone who is biologically probably going to hit it back harder.
Sure.
Right? This is a situation where it is, are you fit enough? Do you have the right physical qualities to be able to handle the conditions of a car?
I'm not saying they don't, but if you were to do that like for like, would they then stand up to the performance times of a
Probably because remember, think about what Nico, the optimum body weight really, or the optimum physique. He stopped cycling to lose weight in his legs. He had to be so refined, so specifically built to be able to drive that car. It probably, if anything, actually favours how a woman would train and be able to be the best performer in that car. Maybe that's the other side. Maybe the men aren't the quickest. Maybe the women are the quickest. We've been getting it the wrong way all around.
Yeah, who knows, right? That would be a first. I'm going to steal that argument when I have to go and do my appearances and I'm talking about D&I. That's brilliant. I think that's the point, and that's what we're probably waiting to see, isn't it? Because actually, up until this point, and still to this day, we have never had a number of women line, or even, for many years. I mean, God, the last time a woman actually lined up on a Sunday afternoon to take part in a race was back in the 70s or the 80s. It was so long ago, I can't remember.
There's an interesting business case also for the expansion of sponsor interest that would come from female drivers.
Oh my God, this drives me nuts, this conversation, because when I was running the team and we were looking at commercial, I said to my commercial team, I want you to pull a list together of every single business in the world that's run by a woman and every single business that is producing products for women. And those are the brands we're going to target, because I am now the only female team principal in Formula One. That sets me apart. Yeah. I need those people, those women and those female brands to come in and support our team. I just thought it was going to be an absolute, back of the net, brilliant goal, right? Not one. maybe it was just too early as well. I mean, now you have, Charlotte Tilbury, is coming in and supporting, but what's frustrating is that Formula One has always been watched by, a huge proportion of women. I mean, back in my day, it was still 60-40, the audience split. And I think it's only just slightly higher now, male versus female. A lot of women watch Formula One. And, for me, it was like, come in and be that groundbreaking sponsor, female-led or female-branded sponsor. The eyeballs you get, such a missed opportunity.
In 2014, you had Susie Wolff as a development driver, didn't you?
Yeah, we did. Just to be very clear, it wasn't done as a marketing gimmick whatsoever, because that was a lot of, you put a woman in the car and suddenly, it's a marketing gimmick. It's you can't win sometimes with this stuff. It certainly wasn't. I mean, I've seen the dangers of motorsport, and I would never, ever put a driver in a car unless I felt that they had the ability to be in that car. I would never do that. So Susie, that was a fantastic, I suppose, showcase for what women can do. And actually, if she would prove the argument wrong about physicality and can a woman drive a race car, the work that woman put in order to ready her body in order to withstand what she was going to have to go through during those test sessions that she did for us was extraordinary. I remember she used to come with her neck in order, she trained her neck in order to withstand the G-forces, was quite extraordinary to look at. And so much, she was so embarrassed by it, bless her, the poor woman, she used to cover it up with a scarf because, a woman with an enormous neck like that is quite unusual. But, she was able to develop physically. And I know when she got out of that car, she didn't stand there and go, oh my God, I can't do it. It was too difficult physically for me. Absolutely not.
Can we do a quick fire? So we say a short statement, you give us your immediate thoughts. What was the most challenging moment of your time as TP?
When we didn't get our car to testing in 2019. Everyone gets their car to testing. It is just an unwritten thing. Nobody cocks that up. And we managed to be 3 days late, 2.5 days late with our car to testing for a variety of reasons. And it was probably the most horrific time of my entire career.
Adrian Newey, value of an engineer. Yeah. Is he worth it?
Or is it 200 million, isn't it?
Over 5 years, about 30 million a year.
Yeah, I think he's worth it. I mean, Adrian is an absolute genius. He spent a long time at Williams. He bought a lot of our world championships together with the wider team. You've seen the successes he's had subsequently, and I think Lawrence Stroll, that was a genius move of his. And yeah, so the money that comes with a championship win is worth whatever he's paying.
And he is.
He's that good.
He's that good.
He's that good.
So that car, that Aston Martin car, is now a potential championship winning car when he has. Wow.
Yeah, which drives me nuts because Lawrence was with us.
What advice would you give to me on how to have some form of protection mechanism when there's a lot of hate?
There's a lot of it. And so as you can imagine, I had a lot. But I was not on social media. And it was a decision that I made very consciously. I was never actually on it, even though I was the first person to send a tweet from the F1 paddock because during my comms time, that was, God, now I'm really showing my age, aren't I? But Twitter had just come out. And so I was the first press officer that ever used Twitter in the paddock.
Wow.
And quite proud of that. God, those were the days. Wish I was still a press officer. Life was so much easier. But no, so I made that conscious decision not to be on it. And I know it's difficult now and you probably do need to be on it, but I just never allowed myself to read any of it at all. And the odd occasion where, I would read an article and stupidly, because you just do, don't you? Scroll down, you want to see the comments because everyone's going to say what on it, like
it's
amazing
like you want
humour.
To get hurt.
Yeah, well, no, it's that you actually think people are going to say maybe nice things. But why is it though? Because some of those things you can read and there'll be 100 wonderful things that people say about you. One arsehole has written something so foul that it then just kind of gets into your whole system for weeks, doesn't it? I just think the best advice I can ever give is just to not engage. First thing, don't look. And I think we all just need to start being a bit kinder to each other.
You obviously grew up in and around the team and then you worked in the team.
Yeah.
Could you put your finger on your favourite period of Williams?
I think those days when, Williams was at the top of Formula One and winning races. And, I would walk down the street and people would be wearing Williams baseball caps and everyone revered my dad. And I was a kid and I would get taken to Silverstone as, a treat. Because we weren't taken to a load of races. It was British Grand Prix kind of, and that was about it. And just seeing my dad, operating that team, doing something that he loved, and just being inspired by that my whole life, and just watching him do what he did. That was just such an enormous privilege growing up, as part of, as his daughter, as my mum's daughter, as part of the Williams family.
Claire, listen, we rarely have this much fun on a show. Like, this has been seriously, thank you so much. Thanks. It has been so much fun. So you've been amazing, and can't thank you enough.
Oh, thanks for having me. I've had a great morning, so thank you. Anytime, love to come back.